Hey everybody, thanks for joining. I think we'll just give another minute or so for people to get logged in. Looks like we're getting toward critical mass. Mary, do you know if Dr. Kopan's joining or on? I see there's a couple, there's a number in here. I don't know who that is, or a call in.
Hi, Ben. He should be calling in. I just spoke with him a short while ago.
There it is. I see he's popped on.
Well, that's good news.
Dr. Kopan, if you are on, feel free to take it away. You might just be pulling it up right now. So there you are.
Very good. Thank you so much. It's great to join you, and good to see you again, Ben, and all the colleagues from the TGDC. Good afternoon to all of our members of the Technical Guidance Development Committee, as well as to our guests who are joining us today via live stream. I'm Walt Kopan, the Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology, and the Director of the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. I'm delighted to be with you once again, and in accordance with the Help America Vote Act, and as Director of NIST, I'm honored to serve as the Chair of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, or TGDC. On behalf of the Election Assistance Commission, our EAC designated federal officer for the TGDC, and our good friend, Commissioner Ben Hovland and NIST, welcome to this web meeting where we'll touch base on the public comments received for the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or the VVSG, and we'll discuss potential paths forward in producing guidance for election systems. This is an exciting time. The EAC posted the draft VVSG 2.0 requirements for public comment on regulations.gov following the advice of this committee. All the comments are now publicly available and NIST and EAC staff have been meeting to review and to address the submitted comments. On our agenda today, we will hear first from Mona Harrington, the Executive Director of our EAC, and she'll provide an overview of the public comments received and will be joined by NIST staff to answer questions. As you might imagine, the comments are wide and varied, ranging from suggested wording changes to improve the readability to decisions on restrictions for wireless communications or support of common data formats. Manufacturers and test laboratories submitted a series of comments as well on whether the requirements are sufficient to test voting systems. These comments are a result of moving specific requirements for the technical data package, the TDP, to the EAC manuals, which are not yet complete. There's also, frankly, some tension between the desire from the testing laboratories to be prescriptive and from the manufacturers to remain flexible. This trade-off was demonstrated in comments against requirements for programming language and coding conventions as well. Others pointed out potential issues in testing commercial off-the-shelf components, particularly for stringent integrity and accuracy requirements and the power and temperature testing required due to the military standards. And finally, a number of commenters said that the requirements emphasize security over accessibility. They said paper ballots add complexity to the accessible ballot marking devices and that fully accessible paper-based voting is not yet available. The commenter suggests that the introduction of the VVSG be expanded to describe how remote digital ballot marking must be provided to ensure accessibility of paper-based vote-by-mail systems. We'll also be focusing today on best practices for guidance, testing, and verification of election systems that are actually beyond the current scope of the VVSG. We will start on that topic with a presentation from Aaron Wilson, Senior Director of Election Security of the Center for Internet Security. He'll describe RabbitV, a verification process that supports rapid product changes using a risk-based approach. In the last half of today's session, I'd like to hear your thoughts on potential approaches for ensuring the accuracy and integrity of these critical components of our election infrastructure. I look forward once again to fruitful discussions this afternoon, and I'm grateful again for your time and dedication to securing our nation's election systems. So next, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Commissioner Ben Hovland, for his introductory remarks to today's session. Thank you, and Commissioner Hovland, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kopan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Hovland. I'm a commissioner with the Election Assistance Commission and the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, or TGDC. The TGDC is a 15-member advisory committee established by the Help America Vote Act to assist the Election Assistance Commission in developing the voluntary voting system guidelines. Pursuant to HAVA, the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, serves as the chair of the TGDC, and I'd like to thank Dr. Kopan for joining us today and for his introductory remarks. This meeting, which is called Pursuant to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, has been noticed in the Federal Register and published on the EAC's website for today's meeting. The meeting is open to the public. Again, I appreciate you all joining this call. I know it's a very busy time, particularly for the election officials who are able to join us. Based on our previous meetings and conversations, we wanted to provide you all with updates on the progress of the VVSG since our last meeting in February. Again, being conscious of your time demands, I wanted to flag that we don't anticipate there being anything today that would require a vote. And additionally, this is being recorded and will be available on our website if other demands require your attention as we go through the agenda. Again, just appreciate your participation. I have gone through the roll on the side and think I have everyone. I see that David Wagner has joined us. Dan Wallach, have you joined us? I see there was a call in as well. Neil Kelly and Linda Lamone send their regards. They got pulled into election-related matters. And so with that, I believe we have the attendance, and I will turn it over to the NIST team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. As ever, a pleasure, and it's a great partnership that we enjoy in this important work of the TGDC. I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Mary Brady, who's the voting program manager of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for her remarks and also for an announcement that she'd like to share with this group. Mary?
Thank you, Walt. So many of you have already heard, but for those of you who have not, I'm retiring at the end of August, and we're currently in the process of transitioning the NIST voting program to Lisa Carnahan. I'd like to take a minute to thank Dr. Kopan, the EAC commissioners, Christy McCormick, Tom Hicks, Don Palmer, and Ben Hovland, the members of the EAC and NIST staff, all of our stakeholders who participate in our public working groups, and the members of the TGDC for your dedication and the support you've given me over the last decade. I've learned so much about elections and the importance of usable, accessible, and secure elections from our interactions. It's truly been a pleasure working with all of you. The degree of professionalism with which you all approach your jobs and the ability to assess and manage all aspects of running elections gives me great confidence in our upcoming election. I will miss our daily interactions. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Lisa Carnahan. I've had the great pleasure of working with Lisa over the years, perhaps for far longer than either of us are willing to admit. Sometime after a reorganization back in the 90s, Lisa and I ended up in the same division here at NIST. She'd come from the computer security division, and I came from the networking division. In those days, we shared many conversations on how to become trusted partners in our respective efforts. I was working with the World Wide Web Consortium in the early days of electronic commerce, and she was working with HL7 on establishing a NIST effort in healthcare standards and testing. I know that Lisa shares the same passion for understanding how best NIST can engage and work side by side with community stakeholders. She brings a wealth of expertise in cybersecurity, privacy, standards, testing, and certification to the table. I'm quite certain that together with the other members of the team, Sharon, Ben, John, Gemma, Andy, Jeff, and Patricia, that I'm leaving you all in good hands. With that introduction, let me turn you over to Lisa. Lisa, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Mary. That was very sweet of you. Thank you for your leadership. You truly are going to be a very hard act to follow. And I didn't in any way imagine it had been 10 years. Wow. So very good. So good afternoon, Dr. Kopan, Commissioner Hovland, and the TGDC members. I'm really excited about this effort, this opportunity to lead this effort at NIST. As Mary alluded to, she and I have been around a very long time, and I have always been around the voting effort because of the organizations we both worked in. So I'm really excited to be part of it. And to be part of the team that continues to demonstrate great technical competence and a really deep understanding of the voting and election systems as we have for almost 2 decades now at NIST. So I'm very excited about that and the team. I'm excited to see the impact of a lot of the current efforts we have going on at NIST and to be part of the team in advancing our program in ways that can contribute to the trust and confidence of our voting systems and our election systems. So I look forward to meeting all of you and starting to work through maybe the next 10 years. All right, thank you.
That's great. Lisa, thank you so much. Mary is an incredibly hard act to follow, but if there's anyone who can do it, we know that you provide the background and the leadership and the tremendous desire to contribute in this important field for our nation. So once again, thank you, a heartfelt thank you, Mary, to you and to your service. We know that you're not going far, so we look forward to remaining engaged with you as questions and as your wisdom may assist. So with that, I'd like to turn it over now to one of the key portions of our program, to Mona Harrington, Executive Director of the US EAC, to provide a summary of the VVSG 2.0 public comments and any updates from the group. Mona? Mona, you're still on mute. So if you would, please unmute.
Oh dear. I'm unmuted now. All right. Thank you. I apologize. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm EAC's Executive Director, Mona Harrington, and I'll be providing you with an update on our VVSG 2.0 progress. The EAC continues to be committed to moving the process of adopting the VVSG 2.0 forward. As you're aware, we've hosted numerous virtual hearings and VVSG annual board meetings, the annual board meetings were focused on VVSG. After receiving the requirements from the TGDC on March 11th, we forwarded the requirements to the executive committees of the boards and simultaneously opened the comment period up. After the May 20th hearing that included voting system test laboratories and EAC registered manufacturers, the EAC in partnership with NIST had discussions with the VISTLs and manufacturers to better understand issues raised at the May 20th hearing. The VISTLs and manufacturers raised concerns regarding a lack of clarity, feasibility, and substantially increased cost to build and test the new voting machines to the requirements. The EAC and NIST obtained technical clarification on some of the major issues during these discussions. The EAC will continue to reach out to the VISTLs, manufacturers, and other stakeholders as needed to clarify technical comments throughout the process to ensure the success of the VVSG 2.0. We received 77 sets of comments and a total of 1,660 comments. Overall, the majority of the comments focused on ambiguity, vagueness of requirements, inconsistent terminology, additions and changes to the glossary, and requirements that are not measurable in the current form. The latter requirements would need to be revised or deleted or have test assertions associated with them. We also received and coordinated comments regarding accessibility requirements or lack thereof. The commenters can be roughly organized into 4 groups: the EAC registered voting system manufacturers, EAC accredited test labs, accessibility rights groups, and other. The manufacturers included in the comments included Voting Works, Dominion, Hart, ES&S, Microvote, Clear Ballot, and Unison. The test labs included in the comments were SLI Compliance and Pro-V&V. The accessibility right groups included were Accessible Voting Working Group, National Council on Independent Living, Center for Independence, Disability Law Center, Disability Rights New Jersey, Disability Rights Maine, Indiana Disability Rights Ohio, Disability Rights California, Arizona Center for Disability Law, Disability Rights Tennessee, Disability Law Colorado, Disability Rights New Hampshire. Other state audit working groups such as Brennan Center for Justice, NYU School of Law, National Association State Election Directors, Free Speech for People, Electronic Privacy Information Center, Voting Methods and Tabulation Public Work Group, Citizens Oversight, League of Women Voters, Boulder, Colorado, Vitaloop, an Association for Computing Machinery, U.S. Technology Policy Committee, were also a number of individual commenters. Examples of vagueness: Requirement 3.1.4-D, election-specific software identification. The manufacturer must identify election-specific software in the user documentation. There was a consensus of comments that stated how confusing this requirement is. Example of non-measurable. Requirement 2.1.1-C, high quality parts. All manufacturers must ensure that components provided by external suppliers are free from damage or defect that could make them unsatisfactory or hazardous when used for their intended purpose. Comments questioned how this is measurable and what the criteria are for testing this. Example of inconsistency. The VVSG uses the word cast inconsistently and is sometimes used in place of approved for counting, while at other times it is used to denote the final action of a voter irrevocably confirming his or her intent to vote as selected. Examples of glossary changes: audit device, voting device dedicated exclusively to independently verifying or assessing the voting system's performance. Comments highlighted that a voting device cannot audit itself, therefore a voting device cannot be an audit device. Accessibility. Accessibility groups and others made specific comments on requirements as well as general comments on the VVSG 2.0 itself. For the accessibility group, many comments were received pointing out that the VVSG 2.0 seems to be more focused on security rather than accessibility, when accessibility is specifically mandated in HAVA and security is not. Additionally, many expressed concerns about the ability for accessible voters to vote privately and independently, especially in an environment where most voting is conducted by mail, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, many commenters in this category expressed their eagerness to have the EAC sunset the VVSG 1.0 requirements to speed up the time frame when more accessible 2.0 systems would be available. Specific comments surrounding accessibility included the overall concern that security trumps accessibility in the requirements. HAVA did not specify security, but specified accessibility, voter independence, and they cited Title II of the ADA in Section 504. They also mentioned segregated ballots, using separate machines, and the impact of vote privacy, as they may only have one or a few votes cast on each machine, since most voters are hand marking paper ballots. The accessibility groups overall are concerned that there isn't a sunset date to previous requirements that would require jurisdictions to update 2.0 in a timely manner. As far as summarizing the other comments received, most comments received supported the rapid adoption of the VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines, as well as the requirements. Some frustration was expressed at the speed of the process, that the original separation of principles and guidelines with the requirements was not maintained, although some commenters expressed that a yearly update cycle is a good compromise. Sunsetting of the VVSG 1.0 requirements was also noted by many of the commenters in this group and was seen by them as necessary to move VVSG 2.0 forward. Finally, many also submitted substantive changes to specific requirements. For the sake of time, I want to wrap up details surrounding the comments, and I have a few other updates, then I promise I'll stop. The EAC is working on several parallel paths in order to submit the following documents to the EAC commissioners by the end of the calendar year: the VVSG 2.0 requirements, the testing assertions, the EAC testing and certification program manual, and the EAC voting system test laboratory program manual. The EAC's testing and certification and cyber programs are meeting twice per week with the NIST voting system program to evaluate and resolve the comments on the requirements. All of the comments related to the introduction section and principles 1 and 2 have been evaluated to date. The EAC testing and certification voting system test laboratory program manuals are being updated to include input from the comment evaluation and the working group. Two other changes that will be included in the program manuals are component level testing and penetration testing. One major change from VVSG 1.1 to VVSG 2.0 was taking testing and certification guidance from VVSG to the testing and certification program manual. We are committed to continue to move this forward, working numerous parallel paths to submit the VVSG 2.0 requirements and the other program manuals for adoption by the commissioners by the end of the calendar year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona, for that very helpful series of insights from the many, many comments that have been received, and we're grateful for your report. I'd like to open it now for the group, for the NIST and EAC staff to address any questions about the public comments and the updates report that we've received from Mona Harrington today. Let me open it up for this discussion, please. Thank you. Mary, Mary Brady, may I ask you to provide any additional comments to amplify on what has been reported, and also on the steps that are already underway in addition to what has been mentioned by Mona Harrington. Mary?
Sure, absolutely, Walt. As Mona mentioned, we are meeting twice weekly with EAC staff. We've gone over principle 1 and 2. A large part of the comments that we just dealt with really have to do with some of the comments from the manufacturers. Mona alluded to this, but let me just reiterate it, that there are some issues with the requirements for accuracy and integrity, and again, the environmental requirements that Walt alluded to, and the overlap with the requirement for the use of the mill standards. We discussed this at some length inside the TGDC, but I think a point that's come across loud and clear in the comments is that in the past, voting systems have been around for, we figured the lifespan for typical voting systems were 10 years or more. But as there's more and more introduction of these commercial off-the-shelf components, these are more consumables. So oftentimes tablets, laptops, desktops that you would go out and purchase have a lifespan of 2 to 3 years, 5 if you're lucky. So I think there is a need to go back and look at some of those requirements and to be sure that we do have the right trade-off there. That they're as robust as we need them to be, yet still allow for COTS if that's a path forward that we can find. One of the other areas that we were just dealing with had to do with programming languages and good coding practices and so forth, and that's another area where much of the documentation indicating how a manufacturer has gone about building their system is encompassed in the technical data package or the DDP, or in the quality assurance or what used to be the quality assurance and configuration management requirements. So many of those are in the process of being moved over to the EAC certification manuals. And as a result of that move, they're not as stringent in terms of requirements. They're more broad-based inside of the VVSG. So there were a number of questions from both the manufacturers on, how do we prove that we built it right? And from the testing labs perspective, how do we also prove that they built it right? I think there was a suspicion that perhaps there were increased requirements here. They weren't necessarily increased; they were updated from the older style. But the idea is that they're being transferred, and that whole suite of requirements is what used to be the TDP and the QACM. Are there any questions there? I think one area that would be great to get some feedback from the TGDC members is on the accessibility front. There are a number of comments that indicate that security has been favored over accessibility. And some of the suggestions, I think there is an understanding that remote ballot marking is outside the scope of the VVSG, but there were a number of suggestions of beefing up the introduction to the VVSG to indicate that remote ballot marking is essential for accessible voters. So I would, I know we spent some time on it at the last TGDC meeting, but I would certainly appreciate any feedback you all have in that space.
Mary, thanks so much. The floor is open for any comments, in particular on the commentary regarding the accessibility requirements within VVSG 2.0. Floor is open for TGDC members to comment or ask questions.
Hi, this is Bob Giles. Can you hear me, Walt?
Yes, Bob, thanks.
Yeah, so a couple things. First, I want to start by congratulating Mary on her retirement and apologizing that we spent the last 5 years and we couldn't get this passed prior to you retiring. So, but your effort will not go unnoticed when we eventually pass this. I have two questions concerning, Mona made a comment that in the public comments, there was something about legal concerns that the vendors raised. I was just curious what they were. This is my first question, and I'll have a follow-up if she could raise that.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Mona.
Hey, Bob, this is Jerome.
Yes.
So one was in regards to patents.
Mhm.
That was one of the concerns was regards to patented technology. And I can pull up the exact comment. It'll just take me a minute if you want the exact language.
And you said, was there another one? Or just
that was the one that stood out as far as the ones we reviewed, where it was just a concern about patented technology. So I can pull up the exact language here.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just.
That's what we had was intellectual property rights and patents surrounding that potential legal issue. So we need to look into that. I don't believe there was another reference outside of that.
Okay, great. And my other question, there was a comment about the yearly review was a good compromise. So I was just wondering where we are with the 3 resolutions we passed last year at our September meeting. Do you have an update on those, since one of them was mentioned in the comments?
I'll jump in and say that one of those was transparency, and I hope that through this meeting and this comment process, you've seen a reflection of us hearing that and doing a better job. I think as for obviously, in relation to your question on the annual update, I don't think that is something that has been broadly discussed in any way that, obviously we have public rules around our deliberation. But I think as we create all of the various products that you heard discussed, I think that's when the appropriate time for us to have those conversations in a deliberative way are. And again, that's, something that we'll eventually need to do publicly. But as far as progress on those, certainly heard that, also heard that from the standards board. And again, that is part of the process of building out all of the documents that make up not only the VVSG, but the testing and certification program as a whole.
So there's no actual document. It's just conceptual still. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying there isn't anything that has been written or proposed in a way to be adopted, but it is on the, if you will, the calendar. We are aware of the recommendation. We appreciate the recommendation, and we will certainly visit it.
Do you have a time frame at all?
Again, the goal, as stated earlier, was to try to get all of this done, and a goal at the end of the year to have all of these things in place. Obviously, that is ambitious considering what was mentioned, but I am hopeful that we will be able to do it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Walt.
Thank you so much, Bob and Ben, for those comments. And the third of the resolutions was in the event that there's not a quorum of commissioners, that the standards and requirements process be permitted to continue in a provisional process to ensure that this group can continue to make progress. And I know that was an area of broad interest to the membership of the TGDC as well as to the commission. And so we've seen tremendous progress already. And Ben, as you've stated, there's a very clear commitment by the commission to ensure that the transparency as well as the momentum that we've built on the TGDC and the issuance of the draft of VVSG 2.0 is moving forward, and that the group is very clearly active in taking those very constructive comments on board to ensure clarity and the full operability of VVSG 2.0 as it's ultimately adopted. Any other comments or questions for the group of Mona, our NIST team, or the commissioners?
Yes, This is
Hi.
Dave Wagner. Would this be an appropriate time?
Yes, please.
This is Dave Wagner. Thank you for the very helpful summary, Mona Harrington. That was fantastic. I believe I heard you mention supporting component certification, and I was wondering if you might be able to share any more about your plans for that. For instance, are there particular components that you're looking to support? How are you planning to roll it out? What does the process look like for developing the standards or the rules about that? Is there any timeline for when we might see that in place?
I think it's still a little bit early to say exactly what that will look like, but the hope will be that it allows for a more efficient and secure process. It seems to be a gap right now and something that we can't really turn a blind eye to. And I think with this huge advance forward with implementing VVSG 2.0, we wouldn't want to leave something that critical out. So more information on that coming soon. I think it's definitely going to be a very good part of a new VVSG, and we'll share details as we move forward on that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. The floor is open for other
Hi.
questions or comments.
Hi, this is Diane Golden. Can you provide a little more detail about the review process for the comments? It sounds like that's being done exclusively with EAC and NIST staff. And if that's the case, what's the end product going to be? Just this is the final VVSG 2.0, or is it going to be more like when you do proposed rules and then you do final rules, and the final rules identify the comments and say, we considered this and rejected it, we considered that and decided to change this because of that comment? What's the end product actually going to look like?
Dan, this is Jerome. Okay, go ahead, Mona.
No, go ahead.
Okay. What we're doing now is, as Mona stated, we meet twice a week with NIST, EAC and NIST, and we're evaluating the comments, and then providing, collaboratively resolving the comments, whether things need to be shifted or removed, or wording changed, or more context around discussion. And the ultimate goal for us is to present our material to Mona, executive director, and she'll do the final review on that before, as she stated, with all these other documents associated with VVSG 2.0, before submitting them to the commissioners. And so that's the process now, is just walking through line by line through all 1,660 comments, and resolving them accordingly. Some don't need any resolution, and others we identified do, based off of the comments that were submitted.
And Diane, this is Mona, and I just want to clarify, we are committed to full transparency in the process. And I think what we'd really like to do is try and make this VVSG 2.0 as robust and coherent and secure and usable as possible, but also respond in some comprehensive way what the compromise was or what we did, so that's clear for every single comment. So we'll be incredibly transparent with what the end result is, and I don't think there'll be any confusion, and we'll work very closely with NIST on that, and reach a comfort level with what we're submitting for commissioners to adopt.
Diane, did you have any comment or in response?
No, that's helpful.
Good, thanks so much. It's very clear to me from the close work between the NIST team and the EAC colleagues that there's a very diligent effort underway to take all the commentary into account appropriately. And quite clearly, there's a lot of work ahead, but the goal here is quite clearly a shared goal to have the most effective, most robust and balanced VBSG 2.0 to meet the needs of the American people in our election system. When I was listening to the commentary, Mona, that you had shared, what was raised in my mind was questions about the scope of the election system as defined. And quite clearly, we have been working within the legal framework, if you will, of HAVA, but also with the understanding that since HAVA was enacted, that there are a number of areas of interest and concern that we've been addressing effectively in the preamble section to VBSG 2.0. I was just wondering whether there have been discussions by the TGDC colleagues with regard to these further clarifying changes to the scope of the election system. Comments? I'm not hearing comments from Mona, perhaps from the NIST team. Mary, was there any
Oh, I'm
comments?
sorry. I thought that was directed to the TGDC. So I.
All right.
Dr. Kopan, I'd be happy to jump in there too, having thought about this a lot.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben.
You know, I think one thing that stands out to me, you know, obviously there were several people on this call who were part of this effort before Dr. Kopan and I showed up. You know, I think one of the things, you know, in some of our final meetings, you know, some of the scope issues came back up. And again, some of those seem like they had been solved years before, but maybe not. And in my mind, I think there's an element of this that is getting 2.0 across the finish line, getting the update to equipment. But then I think there are real conversations that could and should be had about the scope. I think those intertwine with some of the things, though, that are on the agenda later. You know, certainly Aaron Wilson's on. A lot of you are familiar with him. Conversations that he and I had earlier in the year really helped my thinking around e-poll books and whether or not they actually would be appropriate to be incorporated. And so I think that while you know, it is important to get 2.0 across the finish line, update that sort of benchmark, I think as we go forward, absolutely that should be on the table. And I think the conversation later in the agenda is really in some ways a starting piece of that, to have that broader understanding of more election technology than what is incorporated in the VBSG, but then to also think about the limitations of that, whether that's e-poll books that you know, are often connected to the internet, or statewide voter registration databases that tend to be more one-offs and don't necessarily have the same type of market maybe that voting systems or e-poll books do. And so I really think having that broader conversation is useful both for the agency and us thinking about it for clearinghouse purposes, but is also part of a future conversation on scope to be able to identify what is and isn't appropriate. Thank you.
Excellent.
Ben, if I could just add something there, I do look forward to that conversation, but I think specifically what Dr. Kopan, and let me not put words in your mouth, is searching for is there were comments that came up primarily from the accessibility community that suggested, and in fact, they even offered up suggested wording for revising the introduction to more strongly indicate support for remote ballot marking. Sharon, if you're on the line, perhaps you could characterize the comments and suggested changes for it. And I think we're looking for some feedback there.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Right. So let's take the easiest to the hardest. There were some comments on the requirements themselves, but nothing major. Small tweaks, clarification to the discussion, some minor tweaks, some typos people caught. So it's easy edits and at the same time. With respect to the second easiest, some question about deployment and the requirements of, if you get a new system, it was not clear to the people who the groups that commented, that the accessible system, electronic system would have to be upgraded too. And the concern is that the old 1.0 or earlier systems would continue to be in place, even though the overall general system would be upgraded. And so that's not something that we can fix directly in the requirements, or we can't put a date in. So that will have to be discussed with the EAC to make clear what the grandfathering is for the new accessibility requirements. And lastly, discussions about emphasizing, making it very clear that the remote ballot marking needs to be accessible as one route for voters who need accessibility. Again, that's not something we can put directly into the requirements in the VVSG. We are looking carefully over the wording that was recommended, and we'll make a decision about what to include in that. Again, very useful. And so we're deliberating on that. And also we're thinking about doing a guidance paper that would outline what one should do with a remote ballot marking system to ensure that it's accessible as a complement to that introduction. So that's the thumbnail sketch of where we are with the comments.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That's very, very helpful insight. And I know that our accessibility community are critically interested in the progress that'll be made on those recommendations. Thanks so much. The floor is open for any additional comments or questions for the NIST and EAC staff in response to Mona Harrington's report. Well, hearing none, we're delighted to have Aaron Wilson with us here today to provide a report on RabbitV and non-voting technology. Very excited to hear from you today, Aaron, and you've been a tremendous contributor to the entire system of election security, and so the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Kopan. I am going to share my screen. If someone can confirm that that's coming across, that'd be great.
Yes, indeed. It's come across. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Excellent. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the RabbitV program. RabbitV stands for Rapid Architecture-Based Election Technology Verification. So you see why we shortened that up. My name is Aaron Wilson. I'm a Senior Director of Election Security at the Center for Internet Security. We've been focused now for some time on non-voting election technology, and that's really where this process has come together. RabbitV is both a process and a pilot. I'm going to be speaking about both of those today. The scope for our efforts right now are focused on non-voting election technology, which is a definition by exclusion. It's basically an umbrella term that refers to everything that is not a voting system. And so in that umbrella covers, I kind of break it down into tiers. My top tier is electronic ballot delivery, electronic poll books and election night reporting systems, but it also includes voter registration systems, online voter registration, as well as the voter registration backends, polling place lookups, ballot on demand, other types of technology that really assists with the election administration process. And what we know is that there isn't a way to test and verify the security of these systems, across the nation. There are some states doing great work in this and have programs that do test them, but there is no nationwide program or process. And so what we set out to do was identify a way to test these systems that would allow for rapid product changes. What we didn't want in predominantly internet connected systems was a process that would slow down particularly security patches or other innovations that need to get into the systems quickly because the environment around them is changing. We don't want those systems to be stuck going through lengthy processes to approve them for use. So what we tried to do with the RabbitB process is create a change tolerant process that is risk-based, and I'll talk about how we measure risk, how we determine what is high risk and low risk as I go through my presentation. The other thing we wanted to do was consider as much as possible modern software development and testing practices, which really have sort of led the way here in terms of how do we make small incremental changes to software and get it out quickly. And of course, there's many motivations for that, but security is one of those motivations. So what can we take from those modern software development and testing practices and employ in a what we call a verification process? The other thing is we have adopted the requirements that we put out, CIS put out a security best practices for non-voting election technology in 2019, and we've adapted those best practices into requirements. They focus heavily on security and security requirements of internet connected systems. The other thing is so we developed this process, and I'll talk about that, but we've also taken on the role of piloting that process. The goal of the pilot is to vet basically the process that now exists on paper, but do we know it's effective? Do we know that it accomplishes our goals, both in terms of its speed, but also its effectiveness? And then ultimately to be able to provide data from the pilot to decision makers that will ultimately determine its adoption in various states or in some sort of central program. We launched the pilot in February of 2020, earlier this year. We expect some reports, final reports from that by the end of the year. In our pilot, we have 2 active technology providers. They've contributed a lot of time at their own expense. So they're VR Systems and NoInk. Between the 2 of them, they provide 3 products for us to test, 2 electronic poll books and 1 election night reporting product. The process, the pilot itself, this will make more sense as I describe the process, includes an initial submission and at least 1 revision submission. And then we're guided in our pilot by 2 committees. The first is what we call our steering committee. On our steering committee, we have NASED, the state of Ohio, Wisconsin, Maryland, Texas, Pennsylvania, Indiana. We also have the EAC, Federal Voting Assistance Program, and CISA represented on our steering committee, with the goal of understanding all the constraints that these various stakeholder groups bring to the table and trying to accommodate those within the RabbitB process. On our technical advisory committee, we have NIST, including folks on this call. We have Software Engineering Institute, we have OWASP, we have faculty from the Carnegie Mellon University and others on our technical advisory committee, and they advise us on more technical matters in their various subject matter expertise. The reporting at the end of the year will include 3 things. The first is a program description, which is essentially the final version of RabbitB. So, how do we run it? What's the process? What are the rules and the like? It'll include actual, RabbitB artifacts. So what are the reports that we generated along the way as we tested these systems? And then one particularly interesting piece is what we call an economic and operations model paper. And essentially, RabbitB is a testing process. It is not policy. It is not, anything broader than the process itself and the requirements that we're using. So it can be compatible with many different operational models. Who does what, It can also be compatible with many different financial models and who pays for what. And so instead of really promoting one of those or another, what we intend to do is capture all of the different ways that RabbitV could be compatible with those models. And so that'll come out in our econ and operations model paper, which we're working heavily with our steering committee to construct. So RabbitV is a process. This is the diagram of the process. It's an 8-activity process that has a lot of conditions, because what we wanted to create was something that was flexible to the product itself that it was testing, so that we could be as efficient as possible. In order to be as efficient as possible, every product goes through what we call the initial iteration. The initial iteration goes through all of the activities, and you can see some of these activities are more, as we get into them, you'll understand that some of them are more intense than others, particularly the ones there in the middle. The process assessment looks at the actual software development processes of the provider. The architecture review, which is where the process gets its name, looks at the actual construction of the product from an architectural perspective. What are the primary building blocks? How is this thing built? Where are the subsystems? Where are the trust boundaries? Big concepts around how this thing is built so that we can understand its security controls, but also understand the risk of future changes to those security controls. The security claims validation looks at the actual security claims the provider's making. And then the testing rules determination is key, because what we do with the initial iteration is we build out basically a custom testing regime for each product based on that product's architecture and that provider's processes. Because those two things we submit are leading indicators of the risk of future changes and how those future changes will affect the security of the system. And so a well-architected system built with mature, secure software development processes, its future changes will be less risky than a not well-architected system that was built using ad hoc processes that don't have security built in. Those are the two extremes to illustrate the point. But basically, by learning their internal processes and learning their architecture, we build these custom testing rules. The custom testing rules then inform the actual verification. The verification is the word, as we use it here, is just the actual testing. So, and our testing in RabbitV includes both conformance testing as well as penetration testing to really look at the requirements and evaluate if the product is meeting those requirements. So what we hope, if we're successful in the initial iteration yields these testing rules, is future iterations, particularly small changes that are being made to the product, can go straight from the initial submission to product verification without re-going through any of the process and architecture reviews, which are the more lengthy pieces, which we submit will yield much quicker re-verification times, because not only are we skipping the steps that are the more lengthy steps, but also that product verification step is as efficient as we can make it given the architecture of the product itself and the processes that they're using. So I'm going to dive real quick into three of the more critical ones. The first one is the process assessment. So RabbitV is unique, as far as we know, at looking at the actual internal processes of the provider themselves. And when I say it's unique, I mean unique to the election space, because we actually took this idea out of the medical device pre-certification program, where they were looking predominantly at the internal processes of the providers in order to inform their streamlined reviews. So what we've done here is we've created a software development maturity index, which is based heavily on the OWASP software assurance maturity model, which looks at a number of factors around secure software development. We also include usability and accessibility in this. So we call it SAM+. We expanded the assurance model to include usability and accessibility because we want to be able to score the provider on how well they're taking user feedback and adopting it. We also wanted to score them on how well they were incorporating accessibility testing into their internal processes. So that's the process assessment. The architecture review was something that, we weren't able to take something out of the box like the OWASP SAM model that we do for process assessment. So we had to build an architecture review, not quite from scratch, but with a little bit less of an out-of-the-box approach. Essentially what we do here is use a threat modeling approach to identify the system level components. We then we have some tooling that we've adopted to pick apart the software architecture itself. And we've developed a rubric here for architectural maturity that's published in our program description in order to create what we call the Security Service Architectural Maturity Index. And so these maturity scores that come out of this process inform that testing approach that I talked about. So the product verification, as I mentioned, the actual testing of the system. From the testing of the system, we create the Security Service Capability Maturity Index. And I have a whole slide on the indexes. So let me introduce that in just a moment. But as I mentioned, the techniques vary here from the product verification based on the actual product that's submitted and the changes that they've submitted. So in theory, right, you have a product that has a good architecture and good internal processes, and they submit a non-security impacting change. And how do we know it's non-security impacting? Because we know it's architecture, and we can actually tell from what they've submitted that it was outside of some of the security providing pieces of the software. Those are going to be low risk changes in our mind, and so those will yield more streamlined, efficient testing. Getting that product through as quickly as possible. A product change, on the other hand, that does impact the security of the system, particularly for systems that are not well architected, could, in theory, lead to, significantly more testing, potentially at its maximum, redoing everything that's been done before. And that would obviously not be ideal for anyone. So I want to talk about these indexes because the indexes are the outputs of RabbitV. So every iteration of RabbitV produces updated indexes around that product and that product variant version. The first one I mentioned was the Software Development Maturity Index. And so there's an overall score here. All of these are on the range of 0 to 3. The 6 sub-elements of the Software Development Maturity Index, 5 of which come from the OWASP model, and then the 6th one, the human factors one, we added. And so those average up to the overall. And so that's essentially, what are the provider's internal processes related to these aspects: governance, design, implementation, verification, operations. What I particularly liked about this is it included not only how they're building it, but how they monitor it, right? Because when we talk about internet connected systems, we need to understand how they're going to handle incident response. We need to understand their situational awareness around those systems when they're connected to the internet. Are they going to be aware in the event of a security attack? And how are they going to be prepared to respond? So all of that is covered in this process assessment. The next index is the Security Service Architectural Maturity Index. And this speaks to the architecture of the system. We've defined 10 security services. These are essentially the scope of RabbitV. These are the 10 the aspects of security that we are looking at, both from a requirements and process perspective. I won't read them off for you here, but they cover a broad spectrum of the security. We don't think we've left anything out, I guess I should say. And so each one of those are scored independently, both on their architectural, how the system is constructed to provide that security, and then also the capability. And I distinguish these because it's important. The architectural maturity speaks to the reliability of that system over time. So when you talk about authentication, the higher the architectural maturity for authentication, the less likely that changes will break that system's authentication mechanisms. The lower the score, the more likely that changes will break the authentication. And so as you can imagine, the lower the score here, the higher the testing that we will do. The higher the score here, the lower the testing that we will do. And both of these, essentially look at risk, right? So if the architecture is a low score, then we need to do more testing to buy that risk down. If that architecture is a high score, then we don't need to do as much testing to buy that risk down, because essentially that's what verification does, right? Is it says that, well, if it passes, then the risk of use is low. But that's different from capability. So capability is the actual effectiveness of the security service. And you may have, in some cases, a high capability but a low architecture score. What that means is this version of the software does it well, but we're not really saying that the next version will or won't, because the architecture doesn't necessarily support it in a way that's reliable. So capability is super important. It's the one that will probably change the most from from version to version. But architecture is, obviously more of the long-term important number. And then, I would argue the software development maturity is the even more sort of long-term. You're going to yield better results from that. So, overall, we think RabbitV provides an alignment of security assessments to modern software development. One of the things that I didn't quite cover in detail here is that if a provider can demonstrate that they have internal capabilities, robust internal capabilities to do things like configuration, assessments, vulnerability assessments, security assessments, if they're doing those, particularly automated versions of those, those will be also accounted for in the testing. And we won't redo anything that we have previously found to be, reliable. We believe it obviously will yield rapid product revisions, rapid testing of those, allowing for innovation and security patches. We hope that re-verification will be able to be accomplished at minimum cost. Obviously, some of these are what we're trying to figure out in our pilot program. But I want to sit on this next bullet for a second. One of the nice consequences, we think, of this process is that there's built-in incentives for better architectures and better processes, because the vendors will be incentivized to go through quicker testing, right, to be able to get their products out quicker at lower cost. The only way you do that is if you can demonstrate that your architecture is robust and that your processes are robust. And so there's this built-in incentive for them to continually improve those maturity scores in order to minimize the amount of repeated testing that's done every version. And so that applies both to the architecture and the processes. And then, of course, the real goal of all of this is to give a consistent basis from which approval authorities, namely states, can draw information and make decisions about certification and use in their states and in their jurisdictions. I can talk all day about this, so I've limited my slides, and hopefully you have some questions so I can get into maybe some of the other details that I left out.
Aaron, thanks so much. That was an outstanding overview for the group. The floor is now open for questions and for discussion with Aaron on non-voting technology approaches that have been outlined.
This is David Wagner. I had two questions. First one's about transparency. What kind of commitments are you prepared to make about publicly releasing documents and technical details of the results of the evaluation you do? Can you tell us more about what will be released, what will not be released?
Yeah. So we've identified two tiers of recipients. One that we call subscribers. So RabbitV subscribers will be states, locals, and other stakeholders, government entities, those sorts of things. They will have access to significant detail in terms of our reporting, what we found, what was remedied through the process, what wasn't, what was submitted, all those level of details. There will also be a public reporting level that will show those index scores, but without a lot of the nitty-gritty detail that went into them. And some of that, that's how we've envisioned it right now. I think that as we look at our reports that we're generating through the pilot, we'll make a more informed decision based on how sensitive really are those. The assumption we're making is that some of those reports will have sensitive details that don't need to be public and be better if they're not public. That may or may not be true once we actually get to that phase, and so we'll look at that when we get there. But that's the approach right now.
Okay, thank you. I, I would raise questions about whether that will adequately support public trust in the ratings. I guess my second question has to do with these indexes. Can you tell us more about where the indexes come from and how we know that the numbers that come out of this index are going to be predictive of whether the system will experience a security breach? Have they been validated? Have these particular criteria and indexes been used in other industries? Maybe you could just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, the rubric, if you will, right, for what it is that we're using to come up with the scores is all public. It's all transparent. In fact, we actually have everything of our initial program description published. We have a GitHub site that I can give you a link to and give the whole TGDC a link to. All of that's going to be transparent, right? So we have published both the OWASP SAM model is published by them, and we just linked to that. The architecture rubric is published. You know, we've established basically level 1 criteria, level 2 criteria, level 3 criteria, and then we essentially average which of those criteria they hit with the architecture. And then the capability index is based on the requirements. So we've assigned all of the requirements to level 1, level 2, or level 3, and this is all published, and will continue to be published as we update it. And so essentially they hit, you know, which of these requirements do they claim to actually accomplish, and then which ones did we verify that they hit, will all go into the score. So, you know, it's entirely possible we release even which requirements they've claimed and which requirements they've hit, because I mean, I certainly agree with your goal, David, that the level of transparency needs to be there so folks aren't just looking at raw numbers and asked to trust them. They need to understand how we got there. But we also have a goal to keep some of the sensitive information, you know, undisclosed. So I think we'll be able to strike that balance.
Thanks very much for those comments. Other questions or comments on the Rabbit V presentation from Aaron?
This is Lori. As you know, I have a. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lori.
I was just going to say, well, I appreciate. Thank you, Paul. Well, I appreciate this endeavor. I am concerned that the EAC is taking this work on before you've finished your statutorily required work on the VVSG. I think election officials need the VVSG, citizens need the VVSG, so I would urge you to focus on that work before taking on this work, although I do appreciate the presentation and the information shared today.
Thanks so much. I don't believe that there's any intention to take the foot off the accelerator for VVSG 2.0 from anyone on the committee. I think that this is an important complement to that work. And Aaron, we're grateful for the update. Other comments or questions, please?
This is Paul. I just want to. I just want to echo about the transparency. I definitely agree with the need for a better, for a more agile system. And we talked with VVSG, and you know, we have things that, you know, potentially can go unpatched because the certification has to come back around and go through whatever, and there has to be a more agile system in place, particularly as it relates to non-voting election technology versus election technology, just to give the public a better comfort level with it. But also reinforce what Lori said. You know, I know that the main topic of today's conversation is non-voting technology, which of course does not involve the VVSG at all, or shouldn't at this point anyway. Scope creep and all that other stuff notwithstanding, but I really do think that you know, the way the technology is growing in leaps and bounds, you know, whether this could be somehow brought into the VVSG eventually at some point in the future, released, you know, as a system for a more agile set of standards that can change as technology changes rapidly in the environment that we find ourselves operating in. And that's always been a concern for me at the end user level, making sure I'm using systems that are as secure as possible.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for those important comments. Other questions or comments while we're on this topic, Darren?
Hi, this is Diane Golden. So Aaron, I was originally thinking that as you were describing this process, that there would need to be something parallel complementary for accessibility, which seems to be the case. One side's security and one side's accessibility. But then you mentioned the human factors thing, and I saw it up in that one section, but I'm thinking you really are talking human factors, not accessibility in a technical sense, because then you'd need a bunch of rubrics and ratings for accessibility, just like you have security. So help me understand exactly what that human factors piece in that kind of broad section is.
Yeah, so there's two aspects to that. Thank you for the question, Diane. And I think we have room for improvement here. I'll start with that. Certainly our primary goal has been security. But we do look at both accessibility and usability to the extent that we can look at accessibility from an automation perspective. And there are tools that I know have capabilities but are limited at the end of the day. Those are incorporated into the testing. But what I was specifically showed on the process assessment was a look at how the vendor is handling usability and accessibility in their own internal processes. And we have a rubric on this as well. So there are 3 tiers of what we think or what we submit are 3 different levels of maturity, right? One is, essentially an ad hoc process, and then all the way to 3, which is you are getting periodic formal reviews of both usability and accessibility from independent experts. And so, we view that as something that the provider should be doing on an ongoing basis, both with, experts in accessibility and usability, but also with their customers, particularly on the usability side. How are they accommodating their customers' feedback, and how mature is that process? We don't feel like we can do usability through RabbitV nearly as well as the end users can do usability testing. And what RabbitV hopes to accomplish is a quick turn on the security verification so that more robust usability testing can be done at the end user. So if usability is done, if something takes 6 months to get certified, and you wait until the end of the 6 months for your users to test it and say, well, this doesn't work right, and this doesn't, and it has usability issues, you have to wait another 6 months to get the improvements there. What we want to accomplish in RabbitV is days and weeks, not months or longer, so that there's more opportunity for iterative improvements for usability. And I'm separating usability from accessibility because there are some things we can do. Accessibility has some global things that we can do, whereas we feel like usability is more down to the states and the end users. And so what we hoped is just to make a quicker turn so that those end users have more opportunities to iteratively improve. Hope that addresses that.
Thanks so much, Aaron, for that reply.
This is Sharon, if I may make a comment. This is Sharon Laskowski from NIST.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon.
We do have, as part of our requirements of the BVSG, a requirement to report on a developer's user-centered design process. And we have some drafts of actual templates based on the ISO standard for reporting on the user-centered design process, which we've specialized for voting, as well as reporting on the usability of the end product. And that's been in the VVSG since the beginning. So there are ways to report on that. And by usability, I mean usability for everyone, including accessibility for people with disabilities. And that's all specified in the templates. So I'll just point that out, and also at the and one needs to design for usability and accessibility from the very beginning, right? If you're submitting something for some sort of certification at the end, you haven't thought about it, it's like trying to add the sugar in the cake after the cake's baked. So, but there are methodologies for reporting on this.
Yeah, and this is Diane, and I'm just going to follow up because I understand setting end user accessibility or usability aside. I am really thinking about true software accessibility and the inherent conflicts between security and accessibility just in program code itself. Everything you lock down because it needs to be secure tends to create an accessibility problem. So I really am talking about not end user, but and I'm sure you've got some automated checks, but my experience and having worked with folks doing app development stuff, they have no idea. There is just such a lack of understanding about accessibility in programming itself that you guys have a rubric that's really strong. I'm not sure you're going to be getting to, and expecting the vendors to know what about accessibility and coding is cause. So I would just hope there either needs to be a complementary set of rubrics and standards so that you really are getting equitably at accessibility and security within the software code itself, or you need to acknowledge you're not. And anyway, so.
Yeah, great points. And I opened up with I believe we have room for improvement here, and I think that both of your comments are very helpful for that. We'll take a look at those templates that you mentioned, Sharon and Diana. We'd love to have more engagement with you on this so that we can make sure that there's a proper balance in there and that we're not promoting products that produce a secure but non-accessible end result.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Other comments or questions while we're on this topic with Aaron, please? Well, hearing none, let me thank you, Aaron, on behalf of the TGDC and all the participants today. This is very exciting progress. We're pleased in the approach that you're utilizing to provide the kind of transparency and accountability, and clearly it's an evolving process, as you've also been describing, seeking to find that appropriate balance as well that brings together the security needs and requirements with the accessibility requirements and appropriate balance. So again, thank you for a very exciting presentation and great progress that you and the entire team have made to really support the acceleration of product development and the verification cycles. So thank you once again, Aaron, on behalf of us all. The floor is now open for discussion of non-voting technology approaches, building upon the conversation today, as well as the feedback that's been provided as shared by Mona Harrington today. So the floor is open for discussion, questions, and comments.
And Dr. Kopan, I'd love to jump in real quick. Certainly I think part of the reason that we wanted to have this conversation, or that it's useful, and certainly, to Lori's point earlier, absolutely VVSG is our first and foremost priority in the technology space. But I think, obviously since 2016, we're in a changed world in this space and in election technology. We all know that a lot of the risk involved is in non-voting election technology. And, and putting on my old hat at the Senate, while election legislation, federal election legislation doesn't happen very often, you have seen bills in both chambers, led by members of both parties, around doing something with non-voting election technology. And so I think that, having these conversations with a group like this is going to, both one, help us inform our interactions, whether it's the VVSG and the testing and cert program, whether that informs future scope conversations, whether that, we see things through these efforts that could maybe improve that. Certainly we have heard loud and clear for that program to need to be more flexible, more agile, and so looking for those avenues. And then sort of, again, last but not least, non-voting technology and the role it plays is crucial. And whether that is something that gets created congressionally or we just do it under the clearinghouse function, as far as best practices or otherwise, having these conversations now, can lay the groundwork, having these conversations in a way that is more thoughtful and informed by people like the experts on TGDC, we think is a useful to do and certainly a valuable resource. And so we appreciate you all again jumping on today and any thoughts or feedback you have on how it would be most appropriate or useful to look at these technologies that are currently outside of the scope of the VVSG. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Ben.
This is Dave Wagner. I can share a few immediate reactions. I think I'm encouraged, and I think it's positive to see this kind of support for analysis and evaluation of non-voting technology, and I think that's a great direction. I've certainly heard concerns about systems like voter registration databases and e-poll books, and to be able to provide some support to election officials to help inform them and help protect their systems. That sounds like a great goal. And there were several things in this presentation that I thought were quite encouraging to see, to focus on enabling rapid change and not having this program prevent updates or changes. The inclusion of both the architectural review as well as evaluation and implementation. I thought that's quite positive. In industry, we see that the combination of both of those is important to have, that architectural review will highlight some important findings, and then testing and evaluation of the code and the implementation has value as well. I think if I was going to point to one concern that I would raise would be, this is a pilot program, and I think kind of the proof of this will be in how well it works, how useful it is when tried on the first few systems. And I'm looking at how that evaluation is going to be done. And the way that jumps to mind for me for how to evaluate that would be at the end of the pilot, after a few systems have been analyzed, would be two ways. First, to look at the detailed technical reports that are describing the technical details of what testing was done, what the findings were, to try to get a feeling for how comprehensive and how high quality that analysis was. And the second is I would be looking to see if there were any other independent teams that had looked at those same systems and then comparing the findings. And so it sounds to me like the way the program is being described is it may be difficult for members who are not part of this very limited consortium to evaluate at the end of the pilot whether this was effective, whether the analysis was high quality, because that detailed technical analysis is not going to be available. So where normally what I would do to form a perception of how good a firm that does security analysis is, I'd go look at a few of their reports. I'd go look at a few of their technical reports where they analyzed a few systems. And then I would try to use that to get some feeling for the technical capability of them. That it looks like that will not be open to members of the public or to interested independent experts or third-party advocacy organizations, but it'll be limited to just the members of the consortium. So that may pose a challenge for figuring out whether this is a program the EAC, in its role of serving the nation's needs, wants to move forward on, because it won't be able to benefit from that kind of perspective from anyone who's not a member of the consortium. Thank you for the chance to comment.
No, thanks so much, David. Aaron, would you comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think David's goal is the right goal, and we support it. So we'll do what we need to do to give him and others the information necessary to evaluate the program itself and the capabilities of the program. I want to point out what we really are piloting here is the overall process, not the particular capabilities of the people executing it right now, because it isn't necessarily the same people that are going to be executing it if and when it becomes an operational unit. So what I think is most important is the architecture review. You know, did we find in the architecture, things like the rubrics, are they the right things? I don't want to get too caught up into who is doing. I mean, we feel like we've brought in a quality team to run this pilot, certainly, but I don't want to get caught up too much in the particulars of who is actually executing it right now, because what CIS is trying to do is produce data, produce essentially a research project on the process itself, so that decision makers and others can look at that. But there are some things that won't be consistent from here to if and when it becomes an operational piece.
One other thing I'd just like to jump back in quickly. Certainly appreciate, David, those thoughts, and Aaron, and obviously we have Aaron, so would welcome any other questions or thoughts people have on Rabbit V. But I also think our hope is the conversation certainly doesn't need to be limited to that. Again, I look at some of the examples I brought up earlier. E-poll books, there've absolutely been bills that say e-poll books will be included in the VVSG. Does that make sense for e-poll books that are necessarily hooked up online and can be updated with security patches more quickly, or is that not necessarily the best route? Similarly, statewide voter registration databases, obviously one of the biggest focuses since 2016 from a security standpoint, but they don't have a market like voting machines or e-poll books do, and so is the best course of action there simply sets of best practices, or recommendations, and so again, I think we would welcome sort of wide-ranging conversation beyond Rabbit V, but again, thinking about the nature of these non-voting election technologies, and by that, again, statewide voter registration databases, e-poll books, remote blank ballot delivery systems, and election night reporting. Any of those, for example, I think thinking about that technology and how it works, and if there are, again, obviously we have a wide range of experts here. If there are other industry or other things that we could point to that would inform sort of the best way to look at or approach those technologies that are not currently statutorily envisioned for how we would approach them.
And Ben, this is Paul Lux. If I could just add on to what you just said, because of course, the VVSG is about voting systems. So what ties in the non-voting technology to the voting system in often cases is a bifurcated process in a lot of jurisdictions. So you're talking about a completely different audience people. So there are places where you have voter registrars and they do this thing over here and that's all they do. And then you have the people over here who run the elections with the actual voting process, and that's what they do. And so clearly, I don't know how representative most of the folks on the current TGDC are of, which process model are we talking about? So, is there a need for this type of process to be put through for non-voting technology, absolutely, unquestionable. The need for it, but as far as input goes, it's going to be a slightly different animal than the actual VVSG process that we just went through.
Hi, this is Bob Giles. Just to follow up on what Paul was saying, I guess, Ben, how do you envision if you guys were to take something like this on? Because obviously critics will say, you haven't passed the VVSG in 5 years. Why would we want to give you more standards to oversee? I mean, I think it's a fair question.
Well, I mean, I don't think, I think twofold. One, if you want Congress to write standards on this that nobody's had a conversation about, they can do that. So we're trying to provide a forum to have an informed conversation. So it may not be up to us. That is always something we're aware of. And then I think the other part of it is, again, recognizing the breadth of the clearinghouse function, that this is a need. Certainly recognize, the concerns about getting the VVSG done. I hope that we have, adequately addressed our commitment earlier in the conversation. But I don't think you can talk about election technology or, frankly, elections right now, without talking about non-voting election technology. And so certainly think it's an important part of the conversation. I know pre-COVID, we certainly envisioned having, roundtables and more of an agenda on that this year. Certainly some of that's been backburnered with responding to the pandemic, but certainly wanted to use, the experts on TGDC and this forum to at least, keep moving the ball forward in this regard too, and informing our efforts or thoughts in this space.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I'm not just throwing stones. I'm seriously like, how would you envision that? Because if you're going to take on additional standards, how do you prevent it from getting bogged down? Like if we said, okay, you're going to give us some e-poll book, give us some voter registration system standards or guidelines. How do you envision the same process where it's going to take years? Or
I think that was absolutely, that's VVSG is a statutory creation. That's an so we're not in those parameters right now. For people that don't want, federal mandates, us doing best practices and taking some of these on administratively, I would think is your friend. But even if there are, future legislation, something that would consider that, again, in my mind, this can inform that. And so I think part of that conversation is, again, what is most useful for states, for election officials? Is it simply compiling a best practice list and saying, hey, these are things you want to make sure you do with your statewide voter registration database? Or, is it exploring things like Rabbit V that Aaron talked about, obviously, for a while, and seeing what can be done with these technologies that can address, the time and space that we're in.
And that, I guess that's what I'm getting at. Is it a best practices you're looking to do? Because states are, states do want to point to, but states do want to point to something like the VVSG, and there's no doubt, and I understand that that's a statutory framework on how to get there. But if we're going to talk about non-equipment, like non-voting machine equipment that we're discussing here today, I guess that's the question. What does that look like?
We are not a legislative body. So, we can't create anything that is mandated on you. Anything we would be doing is obviously voluntary. But again, to the degree that we have the ability to create a resource to potentially, I know a lot of states have testing and cert programs around e-poll books. Certainly we heard from NAS a lot that's something that, they'd like to see more involvement in this space. And so again, I think, I think, you know, the time that we blocked out for this conversation is what does that look like to election officials like yourself, and for the technology experts, you know, are there examples, you know, that people would point to as saying, oh, you know what, you know, this happens over here, and may really be applicable to this non-voting election technology.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a fair conversation. Thank you.
Bob, let me just sort of jump in here. I think, you know, part of what we're trying to get at is what would be most helpful to you. It's, you know, as election officials and to the technology folks that are part of the TGDC, what kinds of resources might we be able to generate that would help you in evaluating voter registration databases or electronic poll books?
I think, Ben, to the comments that you've made earlier, we're moving really into an era where we have to bring more systems-wide thinking rather than the current sort of legislative constraints that we have that sort of define the charter of the TGDC. And so I think it's a very fair series of questions, as well as not only resources, but specific tools such as described in the RabbitV presentation from Aaron, that I'm sure we're going to all find illuminating as that study goes forward. And we've heard from Aaron the desire to make sure that it winds up delivering the kind of relevance as well as transparency that the voting community and the provider community demands. So thanks very much for those comments. Other comments in response to Ben's comments or any other questions? Well, again, let me say thank you to all of our participants today. This has been absolutely wonderful. And let me first, as we're getting ready to wrap up our session today, which I found very illuminating, Ben, let me turn it over to you for any comments that you'd like to share beyond what you've just done.
Thank you. You know, I would just add, again, appreciate everyone's time today. You know, we're going to continue to, you know, obviously power through on the VVSG, but also think about these other areas of election technology. And so, you know, in no way is this the end of the conversation. If there are, you know, I'm actually surprised so much of this group was silent, but it's a busy time. But if things come to you, if there are, you know, if you have thoughts that you want to share, you know, we would welcome that. Again, I don't think this is an area that all the answers are out there. And I think that there are, you know, real things that we can do under the clearinghouse umbrella to help states, to help election officials. You know, in an ideal world, you know, there are these cost savings that can be realized by federal work in this space. And, you know, e-poll books look like e-poll books, basically, no matter what state you're in. And so, you know, again, happy to explore this under the clearinghouse function and welcome any feedback you have. And again, just thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate today.
Ben, thanks so much. And we're just so happy that you are our designated federal officer and that your service has continued in that capacity. You bring just a tremendous passion as well as a strong background to move this forward. And I'd just like to thank once again Mary Brady for her tremendous service and dedication to the efforts of the TGDC, the close partnership also with this body, as well as with the Election Assistance Commission on behalf of NIST. So let me just begin a round of applause for Mary with saying thanks to you. And we have a virtual standing ovation here from all of the participants in the call today. So Mary, once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your service, for your leadership, and for your great efforts. And Lisa, really looking forward to your stepping in. This has been a very important conversation today, and I'm just so pleased at the progress that we're making. As mentioned at the very outset, and also at the closing of our call today, we're going to move forward very aggressively toward the completion of VVSG 2.0 and the integration and the appropriate dealing with the public comments in an open and a transparent way. We're also looking forward to the full adoption of that in its final form. We have a commitment to move forward on an ongoing basis to see VVSG as a living document and as something that can be adapted very systematically over time, and that's, I know, our shared goal. And then thank you also to Aaron and also to Ben and all who participated in the discussion about the non-voting technology approaches. It's important for the benefit of the nation that we take a systems approach and that we look at the interconnections between all of these elements that comprise operability, security, and accessibility. And so I thank all of the members of the TGDC. You represent a great asset to the nation. Thank you for your commitment to this important effort. And we look forward to the future consideration about how we address and integrate the non-voting technology approaches with what's considered currently in scope for voting systems and in the charter of HAVA for the work of this important committee. So before I close out, let me give Mary Brady a chance to say whatever she wants to say before we close. Mary?
Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the kind wishes. Sincerely, I have enjoyed working with you all. It's been stressful at times, as there's no doubt about it, as we've handled a lot of very touchy subjects. But through it all, I've had great people to work with. You've been great partners in this endeavor, and I look forward to seeing you get the VVSG across the finish line. And hopefully, I won't be a stranger. That I'll be there to help see it through. So thanks, everybody.
Okay, Mary, thanks so much. Truly appreciate it, and I know heartfelt thanks from each of us. We have a commitment to meet regularly as a TGDC. Sort of our minimum pace has been on 6 monthly, but these last couple of years we've had a lot of meetings and a lot of team meetings in between our formal gatherings. So I'd just like to thank this entire group for your efforts, to your commitment. I'm looking forward to that pace continuing. We heard today the report that the subcommittee on VVSG 2.0 is meeting twice a week. That's a great pace, and we are just grateful for the commitment as part of getting TGG's efforts on the VVSG 2.0 across the goal line and fully in place. And so at least for myself, I'm looking forward to our next formal meeting to take place after the elections. I think we'll have a lot to process then, but we know that there's a lot going on between now and then. So I encourage your continued engagement with Ben and with me, with the other members of the TGDC in the interim, and let's get VVSG across the goal line as quickly as we can. So thank you all. Wishing you health and success in your ongoing endeavors, and to a great election season as we look forward to November of this year. Thank you all for your service to the nation in this important effort. So with that, Ben, any final comments before we wrap?
Thank you, Kopan for all of that. And I would say this officially concludes this meeting of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.